Welcome into Sideline Signal. I'm Andrew, joined by Tyler as always. With the out of conference games coming to a wrap in college football, we decided as conference play is about to begin, why don't we give our predictions for the college football playoffs? Obviously, the 12-team playoff is the new feature this year, going from 4 to 12 now. So we wanted to give you our insight to what we've seen throughout the season so far and what we can expect going into the college football playoffs down the line. How are you doing today, Tyler?
I am excited. As you said, we're getting into conference play. There's going to be a lot of crazy matchups, and with the playoff predictions, anything can happen. So we could be completely wrong with this, or we could be spot on. So there's a bunch of different routes here, and I expect that we'll have some differences between the two of us. So it's going to be a lot of fun to go through this.
Definitely. And one of the favorite things for me this year with the college football playoff is the introduction of the group of five automatic bid. Definitely a lot of teams right now that could, it's pick your poison on who you want there. So I'm sure we'll have some interesting takes on that. But to start off, why don't you give me your top four seeds, the teams with the automatic bye in the first round of the college football playoffs?
So if you guys haven't seen by now, I am a staunch conference realignment. I'm against it completely. I hate that there's a Power Four, but that's what we got now. So I'm going to go through my Power Four conference champions here. So the first one, I'm going to start with my one seed, and that's going to be Georgia, the SEC champion. I think it's going to be interesting because Andrew and I kind of talked about this before we got on to record. The SEC is going to beat each other up. That's what it kind of seems like. Obviously, Georgia, I highlighted a couple of games, including an SEC title game that I have them getting to probably against another top five team here, but they're going to Tuscaloosa this weekend, probably the game of the year. Going to play Jalen Milroe in there in that violent and volatile environment there in Bryant-Denny Stadium. Then they go to Texas in Austin in October, mid-October. It's going to be awesome there. We'll see where they are in that. That could easily be a 1-2 matchup if Georgia survives this weekend. And then they also go to Ole Miss in November. That'll be a huge game. So I got Georgia winning the SEC, but there's like five, six, seven teams that could win the SEC right now and be in the playoffs. So that'll be really interesting. But for right now, I think Georgia has sold me the best. Uh, just in where the schedule lines up, who's going to beat who I have beating who. So I'm going to go with Georgia as my one seed. There for my two seed, I got the Big Ten champ in Ohio State. We haven't seen much from them just because they haven't played anybody yet. That is going to change shortly. Obviously, they got a big game at Autzen, at Oregon in October. Andrew will be hyped for that one, I am sure. Then they also have to go to Happy Valley against Penn State in November. And then there's a couple of sneaky games. They have to go to Indiana and they're home against Nebraska. Those will be two great games, in my opinion, that really will determine what this Ohio State team looks like down the stretch. I do think that the Big Ten, like the SEC, is going to be between two teams that are going to make the playoff, that Big Ten title game. So I think that even though I'm not going to spoil it because we'll get to that later. But the team that they play in the Big Ten title game will also make the playoffs, but it'll be more so who gets to bye there. So I'm going to go with Ohio State as my two seed. In my three, I got the Big 12 champion in the Utah Utes. I think Cam Rising gets back to healthy pretty soon, and their schedule doesn't look too daunting to be able to get through undefeated to that Big 12 title game. Their hardest games are the Holy War against BYU at BYU in November, and then home against Iowa State. Uh, that's going to be a game that really probably determines who's in the Big 12 title game, the way that it's going with Iowa State still being undefeated to this point. So those two games are the games that I highlight. Actually, I made a mistake there. They're home against BYU. It is not at BYU. So that makes that game a bit easier, even though it'll still be a pretty huge game with a lot of implications coming up. And then in my four seed, I'm going to go with a team that I really didn't want to go with, but my brain overruled my heart here. I'm going to go with Clemson winning the ACC. Their schedule, in terms of what a Power Four team has to do to get one of these top four seeds, is probably the easiest, with exception to Miami, who's probably got it easier. Their hardest games left on the schedule. They're home against Louisville in November, and then they're at Pitt 2 weeks later in that late November kind of window. Pitt looks really good right now, as does Louisville. But I think Clemson pretty much cruises through the ACC schedule. I could see them picking up a loss, but not really convincing enough to where I'm definitely sure that they will. So they get to that ACC title game probably against Miami, and end up winning that one. Just that's the difference between Dabo Sweeney and Mario Cristobal. Cristobal hasn't been in this situation a lot. He has before, obviously. He was at Oregon and then obviously with Miami in these last couple of years. But Dabo Sweeney's been there. He's been to national championships. He's been in the ACC title game basically every year. So he knows how to get his guys ready, and I think Cade Klubnik has been amazing, and I expect that to continue. So I got them in my four slot there. So those guys are all getting buys here. So Georgia, Ohio State, Utah, and Clemson are my four teams getting a bye. So, Andrew, well, who do you got winning the Power Four and getting your buys for the
Yeah.
playoff?
So we have a little bit of difference. So to start off, my number one overall seed is also the SEC champion, but I went with Texas. And I think
Ooh.
Sarkisian has this team looking serious. Obviously, a guy like Quinn Ewers, he has experience in the playoffs from last season when they lost to Washington in the semifinals. But I think this team is extremely well put together. Obviously, Quinn Ewers right now is dealing with an injury, but they have two extremely capable quarterbacks in Quinn Ewers and Arch Manning. Obviously, Arch, has a little bit of experience against UTSA and, some teams that aren't that exciting, top level teams. But, getting a guy in and getting reps so your starter and your backup are both top of the line. Very, very impressive out of them so far. Gunnar Helmet, tight end, has been great. He's very impactful in their win against Michigan at the Big House. Jarrett Gibson's been running the ball really well, and Isaiah Bond has been potent on offense as well. And defensively, they're very sound. And the SEC is really a toss-up at the top of the conference. Bama could easily be the SEC champ. Georgia easily could. Texas could. There's a lot of teams. I mean, LSU could sneakily play an upset. There's a lot of teams, Missouri as well. Pretty much everybody at the top with how many good Ole Miss as well. I keep naming more, but they easily, any of them could sneak their way in and be that team to win it all. And I think a lot of them split against each other, but I think Texas for me has looked the best in my eyes. Georgia's had some shaky games. Alabama didn't look that great against South Florida. Ole Miss hasn't played anybody yet, so it's hard to tell. Missouri, they had a really close game with Boston College. So right now, when I look at the SEC, especially at the top, the most consistent team for me has been Texas, and they have one of the bigger wins this season. Tennessee also could be a team gunning for it, but a lot of top teams. But to me, Texas has been the most consistent. I think once Ewers gets fully healthy, they'll just continue to roll through. They'll win their big games, and I think ultimately they'll beat Alabama in the I think Alabama was who I had them beaten in the SEC championship. Whoever I had against them in the SEC championship, I think they'll go through and win. But yeah, SEC, it could be anyone's game this year, but for me, it's Texas. My number two overall seed is out of the Big 12. I have the University of Utah. And honestly, this is a team that has looked solid with and without Cam Rising. Isaac Wilson's come in, Zach Wilson's younger brother, and he's looked impressive. They just had a really big win on the road at Oklahoma State. Um, but yeah, looking at the Big 12, a lot of their top teams have kind of been hit and miss. Like I said, Utah just beat Oklahoma State. They don't have to worry about them. They already have that win on their resume. Kansas State, they just lost at BYU. They've been good. Avery Johnson's been carrying them, but at the same time, a loss to BYU is, a stain on that resume. And then Iowa State, they struggled in the Cy-Hawk game, barely beat University of Iowa, whose offense still looks to be struggling a little bit. So, the Big 12, again, it could be anyone's game at the top, but Utah has by far looked the most consistent. And if you, like you said, if they're able to beat BYU, and I think they'll play Iowa State in the Big 12 championship game, but if they're able to get through the regular season undefeated, I have no reason to believe that they won't end undefeated. Do I think they're necessarily the best team in this playoff? No, but I think that they're the best of the Big 12, and to me, if Cam Rising comes back and plays up to that level, they'll be able to coast through the rest of their Big 12. Another stat about them too, defensively, they've been great. They've only allowed 21 plus points once this season. It was
Wow.
against Utah State, but so far they've been holding teams to under 21 points defensively without a starting quarterback. So if the defense is able to stay consistent there, again, going into the brunt of that Big 12 schedule, having a good defense will win you the championship there. My number three overall seed is out of the Big Ten. It is Ohio State University. And, as an Oregon fan, I want to sit here and say, oh, Oregon at Autzen, they have the chance. They definitely do. But Ohio State right now is one of the best teams in college football, period. They haven't had the toughest schedule yet, wins over like Marshall, Akron, all of that. So, it's going to be a big test once they get into the Big Ten schedule. And like the SEC, there's a lot of teams gunning for the Big Ten this year. Illinois, Indiana, Nebraska are some underrated teams. And you got obviously Oregon, Penn State, Iowa, some teams like that. But Will Howard and Quinshon Judkins have been so good offensively. Again, they haven't played the toughest schedule yet, but they're just doing exactly what is expected out of them. They've scored 49 plus points offensively in all three of their games this season. And even though they have a very tough schedule, I think they just slightly edge out teams like Penn State and Oregon at the top. I think it'll be, really interesting to see come like last 3, 4 weeks of the season where we're at. But I think Ohio State right now has probably the best path out of every team in the Big Ten. And then my ACC champion for the 4 seed is the University of Miami. But my championship game was like yours. I had Clemson versus Miami. And I just think Miami's been the most consistent team in the ACC this year. We've seen a lot of turnover, a lot of teams playing upset. Boston College has looked good at times, and Florida State's been awful in the ACC. But yeah, I think Miami's looked the best. Cam Ward is definitely a Heisman contender. I think they comfortably win the ACC. Clemson, their only loss so far being to Georgia week one, where Klubnik didn't look great. So I think they could easily get it turned around. But to me, when I'm looking at the ACC, the team that scares me the most is that Miami team. And like you said, Cristobal doesn't have as much experience at the top, so to speak, like Dabo does. But I think this will be the moment where he kind of, sets himself up and says, "We're winning this year. This is the year of Miami." So the U will be my 4 seed. Definitely interesting. Could go any way. All these teams, all these conferences are very, very, set up, and there's so many teams that could be there. We could be sitting here looking at our top four week 9, and none of these guys be in contention anymore,
Yeah.
which makes me laugh. But moving on, starting with your number 5 seed, who is your group of five team that you have winning that automatic group of five bid?
So with my first matchup here, the 5 versus the 12, I got the Oregon Ducks as my 5, rematching the Boise State Broncos in that 12 seed. We got a classic the first time. It was an amazing game. I think both of these teams have really, or at least for Oregon, they figured it out. I think they've started to get it rolling here. They got some tough games coming up in Big Ten play. It is going to be new for them having to, well, actually, don't even say that because the Pac-12 was loaded. They were playing teams week to week that it was going to be close no matter what, but they host the game versus Ohio State, then they host Illinois, and then they go to the Big House towards the end of the year and play Michigan. So those are some great games there. And then for Boise State, their biggest game by far on the schedule left is versus Washington State this weekend. That may determine who is the group of 5 seed right there if both teams are able to win out after this game. So they got Washington State. Then they obviously have to go to Vegas and play UNLV, which is probably going to be the Mountain West championship before the Mountain West championship. Like we could see basically who gets home field advantage for that game. It's looking like, and then they also play Oregon State. So that'll be a couple of games that really test their mental there. But that game, Oregon versus Boise State, 2 weeks ago, Aston Genty looked amazing. The Oregon looked bad for most of the game, but ended up pulling out the W. I would love a rematch like that. And looking at this 12-team playoff and predicting these teams and looking at like what we would have as these first round matchups, these games would be awesome at any time. Like a week 1 matchup, non-conference, a bowl game, what have you. It's spectacular that we get to see these in the playoffs. So my 5 seeds Oregon, my 12 seeds Boise State. So I'm gonna go ahead and pass it to you. Who you got as your 5 seed, and then who you got taking that group of 5 bid, or I should say, the group of 5 bid, because there could be multiple.
Yeah, so I will go with my group of five bid, but I just realized they actually aren't my five seed. So to start off with the 5 versus 12 matchup, I have Washington State as my five seed, and I have them taking on the 12 seed Iowa State. And Washington State is a team, they're playing a Mountain West schedule. They have Boise State this weekend, which to me is the ultimate decider. I think, Boise State looked really good against Oregon. Ashton Genty's been great, but Washington State has been a firebomb of a team. They have been great so far. John Matter has thrown the ball extremely well. He's passed for 1,100 yards and 11 TDs so far this season. And they're one of the leaders in points per game and yards per game offensively this season. And yeah, they're like you said, they're playing a Mountain West schedule. Oregon State, UNLV, and Boise State are probably their toughest matchups left. And then obviously they don't play in the Mountain West championship game, but looking at it, they easily could get in as an undefeated team. That's what I have them doing. The fact that they're scoring and moving the ball so well offensively, especially with that Apple Cup win over Washington, I think that's great for their resume. They could easily be one of the at-large bids. And then Iowa State is a team, I have them really competitive this year. Um, Close win in that Cy-Hawk game. Like I said, they didn't look the best, but they have enough, bulk on that schedule in the Big 12 where they could, easily be a one-loss team looking at an at-large bid. And then I'll, segue to my 6 versus 11 because that's where my true group of five team is. My sixth seed is James Madison University out of out of Virginia. And this comes obviously a little bit of reactionary reporting because they just had their big 70-50 win over Power Four, ACC school UNC. But they've looked really solid so far this season. Alonzo Barnett at quarterback has really been the centerpiece for them. Defensively, I mean, Jacob Dobbs has also looked really underrated at linebacker. He has 21 tackles already this season. So, they're set up well as a group of five school. Not a lot of people talked about them early on, but looking at the Sun Belt, that's one of the better group of five conferences. And their toughest opponents, in my opinion, remaining are probably Coastal Carolina and Louisiana Lafayette. But those are easily two winnable games. Coastal's coming off a loss to UVA this season, last week, and I really think that JMU has a good shot at winning the Sun Belt this year. And App State's not what they used to be. Coastal, kind of is, kind of isn't. And then we'll have to see what some of the other schools like Georgia State and all of them look like. But to be honest, I think JMU could easily, get in, win that Sun Belt, and go undefeated. And that's what I have them doing, obviously. And then I have them playing the 11 seed Ole Miss. And, Ole Miss, again, it's a team we haven't, like Ohio State, we haven't got to learn a lot about them yet because their non-conference schedule has been extremely easy. They've had dominant performances, but it's not against the best teams, so to speak. And they have a difficult SEC schedule, a lot of teams that, they can win or lose against. Ultimately, I don't have them winning the SEC, but I think with how difficult their resume is, they're going to be one of the top teams in strength of schedule. Pretty much the strength of schedule at the top is going to be all the SEC schools and the Big Ten schools, but I think they split a lot of those top 10 matchups in the SEC, and I think just slightly, I have them edging out Georgia as the last SEC school. I don't have Georgia making my playoffs.
Wow.
Yeah, I really liked what I've seen out of Jackson Dart so far. Ole Miss has looked good. We'll have to wait and see once they actually start playing the SEC schedule. But for me, like I said, JMU 6 seed, Ole Miss 11, Washington State 5 seed, Iowa State 12 seed. But I know I kind of got ahead of myself because of my two group of five schools. But let's look at your 6 versus 11. Who did you have, or unless you wanted to speak about mine?
Well, first of all, I want to say that's crazy that you don't have Georgia, but honestly, it's realistic at this point, based on their schedule and based on just other SEC teams' results there, that, like we said, they're probably going to beat each other up down there in the South for the entire season. So we could see that, but I could also see like a three-loss or a two-loss SEC team sneaking in to that last seed just because of how loaded that conference is. And if you were going to pick one of those, would be Georgia because they do play at Alabama, and then they play at Texas, and then they play at Ole Miss. If they were to go 0-3 in those games, there would still be an argument to them making the playoff. But that would be awesome, honestly. I would love that. It's a breath of fresh air to sit here and say, hey, Georgia maybe won't make the playoff based on their schedule and what how we see that playing out. But for my 6 versus 11, this is my dream matchup. This is my favorite matchup of the games. I'm going to go with the 6 seed Miami Hurricanes. I have them going undefeated all the way up to the ACC championship game against Clemson versus the number 11 seed Tennessee Volunteers. This is going to be interesting for Tennessee because I honestly have them going 10-2 up to this point, losing home against Alabama and then at Georgia. Definitely their two hardest games on the schedule, but I feel like you can't count that against them if you're going to put Georgia as the 1 seed. And then I have Alabama in my playoff. I'm not going to tell you where yet. But this would be awesome. Cam Ward, the vet versus the rookie and Nico. Same kind of team, very physical defensively, pretty great, I would say, defensive line play thus far. Cam Ward has got that swag. We could see both of these guys in New York possibly for the Heisman ceremony, but I just want to go back to say like Cam Ward, he's on a mission this year. I don't know if you guys saw up at the clip of him in the fourth quarter, literally telling USF where they're going to run the ball and score from the 1 yard line, literally saying, hey guys, we're running it in this A gap, and then them being able to execute it and do it just speaks to how poised he is. We've seen it. He's been nonchalant the whole year. And he's been amazing at it. I've never seen anything like it. Like even in the pros, you don't see guys that are just jogging out of bounds or so nonchalant in their play fakes and still being able to execute amazing throws and plays. For Miami, their schedule, they got 3 hard road games, in my opinion, but not games that they should lose by any stretch. They travel to Louisville, to Georgia Tech, and then at Syracuse in the Carrier Dome late in the season. Those are games that'll be hard, but I see them winning those. So that's why I got them in the sixth. I think they lose to Clemson, as I said, in the ACC title game. But that's a toss up in my mind. When Andrew said that he had Miami winning that game, I could definitely see that. That's kind of where I got the 50-50 split. And then Tennessee, I think they take care of business besides Alabama and Georgia. So that's my 6 versus 11. We go to Hard Rock Stadium. Tennessee versus Miami. That could have been the Orange Bowl a couple of years ago. So that's basically what it'll be at this point. All orange of Tennessee versus the actual orange known state and stadium in Miami there. So Miami versus Tennessee is my 6 versus 11 matchup. Moving on to Andrews here, 7 versus 10 as we get kind of tight there, where you got teams moving up and down your rankings, kind of a toss up jumble of teams there. So who do you got for your 7 versus 10 matchup?
Yeah, so I'll start with my 7 seed. It's University of Oregon, and I think they're just the next best team in the Big Ten behind Ohio State. Penn State obviously could be a team that squeaks in either as an at-large or, over Oregon. But when I look at Oregon, obviously a little biased as I'm a fan. They've definitely showed improvement when they played Oregon State from that slow start, against Idaho and Boise State. But there's been a lot of good takeaways offensively and defensively. Starting with offense, I mean, Dylan Gabriel is starting to look more and more comfortable passing for them. The offensive line is starting to settle down. There's not as many penalties that they're giving up, whether it be holdings or illegal formations, which is great. You can't count out that receiver core. Obviously, having guys like Tez Johnson, who is an incredible slot receiver, and then Evan Stewart, who was the Texas A&M transfer from last year. That's such a great 1-2 punch. Yeah, and then, another great 1-2 punch at the running back game. Jordan James and Noah Whittington have both been two great power runners. Defensively, they've looked good too. Jordan Birch and Jeffrey Bassa have continued to be two of the top defensive players for us. But I just want to see more consistency throughout the Big Ten. Obviously, not the most exciting games in terms of what you expect as an Oregon fan, but ultimately, I think they play out. They'll lose one game to Ohio State, and that'll be it. But I think they still get in as an at-large. Consistency is the name of the game. Dan Lanning knows that. He has experience, so he's gonna continue to push the guys up and through. And I think they'll show signs of improvement every week and keep getting better. But yeah, I don't know if they have enough to beat Ohio State right now. And then my 10 seed who they'll be playing is Oklahoma State. Yeah, I have a lot of teams out of the Big 12 this year. Obviously, I talked about Iowa State and Utah, but Oklahoma State, I'm not super worried about yet. It's been, there's been some inconsistencies from the top teams in the Big 12, But Alec Bowman, he's got the experience. He's 26 years old. Uh, you know, Mike Gundy's gonna get them back focused after this loss. Yeah, the Big 12 is super splittable. I think that one loss to Utah won't shake them. It has in the past, but I don't think it will. And I think looking at resumes, they'll be able to win the bulk of their games remaining, and they'll get in as the 10 seed. But yeah, pretty bang forward outside of Oklahoma State. I think Oregon is one of the best teams that will get in as an at-large um, outside of the SEC schools. But what was your 7 to 10 matchup?
So this is going to be another crazy matchup that we'd never see before. That would be pretty terrific. So I got my 7 seed Penn State. I think Drew Aller has found himself. I don't think their schedule is too difficult outside of that Ohio State game. They do have to travel to USC in Los Angeles, which will be very interesting. They can't drop that game if they're going to make the playoff. They got to beat USC there, and then they also host Illinois, which would be a crazy game. I actually, when I was going through it, I texted Andrew this. I had Illinois winning this game against Penn State and actually making the playoff, but I'm sorry, Illinois, it's just not going to happen this year. I had to switch it up there, so I went back on my prediction there. So I got Penn State as a 7. Now imagine a whiteout game in Happy Valley as a playoff, and the team on the road is the Alabama Crimson Tide. I have Alabama as my 10 seed. Another team that I could see having 2 losses and still making the playoff. Obviously, they're hosting Georgia this weekend. Then the third Saturday in October at Tennessee, which will be a massive game for playoff implications. And then they also host Missouri. I think that's a sneaky one that I actually have them losing. At least for now. I'm not. I know we're trying not to get into the records, but it's pretty important as to why I put them as the 10 seed. But imagine Penn State whiteout game versus Alabama. That's got to be the night game of the playoff. That's a great matchup. I think Jalen Milroe has cemented himself as a Heisman candidate. But I do believe that just because the SEC is so loaded, that they're due to drop. And honestly, I see the loser of Georgia and Alabama kind of being on the brink here this weekend based on their two schedules as teams individually. So it's a must-win game this weekend. If they are to win that, the path becomes a lot easier. But if you lose, you have to win those other 2 games. Same for Georgia. You have to win those other 2 games to make it. Surely that's kind of where I'm going with this. But Penn State versus Alabama is my 7-10. A matchup that we don't get to see very often, but a great one nonetheless. And I just cannot wait. I don't want the season to end, but I can't wait for these matchups to kind of come on here and we get going towards it as we get closer to the conference championships and then finding out what that bracket looks like. So we're on to our final matchup here, the 8-9, a true toss-up of it. So Andrew, who you got as your 8 seed and your 9?
So my 8-9 matchup is University of Alabama at 8 and Clemson at 9. And you've talked about Bama and Clemson already, so I'll try to make it brief. But Alabama, I have them beating Georgia, I have them beating Ole Miss, but I have them losing to Texas. I think they are, looking really solid so far outside of that USF game with Kalen DeBoer. I think this is a statement game that they make this weekend to show, hey, we're still Alabama. So I really like them still. They just have so much talent, in terms of experience and youth. Some of their freshmen look really solid. Jalen Milrose looked great, and I think ultimately they won't win the SEC, but they'll have enough out of that schedule. They'll get some big wins. And 8, might be a little harsh for them. I could easily see them getting moved up. They could potentially be a 5 seed, a 6 seed, depending on what the committee like. But I have them at the 8. I have them playing Clemson. Clemson, I think they're the next best team in the ACC so far in terms of what they've proven. If you go in and you're 2 loss, but your 2 losses are to Miami in the conference championship and Georgia week 1, I don't think there's any doubt in my mind they'll still get in. Dabo Swinney's got to get more out of Cade Klubnik though if they want to be successful in the playoffs. Obviously, if they're playing Bama at Bama in the first round of the playoffs, it's not going to go well for them. But yeah, Clemson, they don't look bad, but I still need to see more out of them. But they're the second best team in the ACC. They should be able to walk their schedule. Yeah, 8 versus 9. Like I said, kept it short and sweet. Bama versus Clemson. Who's your 8-9 for your final first round matchup?
So I actually got an SEC matchup, but not one that we'll see during the regular season, so it'll still be interesting. I have my 8 seed, the Texas Longhorns, versus my 9 Ole Miss. I want to preface why I put Texas behind Penn State, is because I see them having the same record, but I believe that Penn State's schedule is a bit harder, and I know that's wild. We've just been hyping up the SEC all this, but if you look at those three games that I listed at USC, home against Ohio State, and home against Illinois. I think it's better than what Texas has got left on their schedule. A neutral site game versus a struggling Oklahoma team right now. Just bench Jackson Arnold there for a true freshman quarterback. They host Georgia. That'll be a huge game. And then at Texas A&M. So I really feel like Penn State's going to have a better resume at the same record if you don't have Texas beating Georgia, which I don't. I have Georgia beating Texas. So that's kind of where I put them there. But like you said, you touched on it already. They got two quarterbacks that could start for them, and they'd be fine. Arch Manning struggled a little bit, but it was L.U. Monroe, and it was also his first start, so I'm not going to sit here and brag on him for that. But Quinn Ewers, uh, he is my favorite to be the Heisman, even though he got injured. If he were to come back next week or in 2 weeks and still put up the numbers that he was on track to put up, I think he should be in New York. And then for Ole Miss, my personal favorite QB, who isn't named Quinn Ewers for the Giants, possibly Jackson Dart. As you said, Andrew, they've played a really soft schedule, but it will not be soft once they get into SEC play. I just highlighted some games here at LSU. That game is going to give me a heart attack. If you guys remember last year, what that game looked like, it was just a track meet from start to finish. It was awesome to watch, but obviously not the result I wanted. Hopefully they can get revenge in Death Valley, what I assume will be a night game as well. Then home against Oklahoma and home against Georgia. If they're going to really sit here and be like, we're a big dog, we should be up on that porch, kind of in the upper echelon of college football teams, they got to beat Georgia. That's kind of where it is. They could still make the playoffs if they don't. That's kind of where I see it as that being their one loss. But this game, Texas versus Ole Miss, kind of two similar kind of schemes here. Lane Kiffin and Steve Sarkisian, two great young coaches. Ole Miss is kind of out talented on the defensive end in this particular matchup, but in terms of getting in, I think this will be another great one. In Austin, and I think Ole Miss. That's one of those games that I could see Ole Miss kind of like sneaking away with it. I won't go get into it too far, but yeah, that's my 8-9 matchup. So I do want to ask you, like, what do you think of these first round matchups? Which one is your favorite, hypothetically? Like, which do you think will be the best game of your matchups?
I mean, I think right now, in terms of the matchups that aren't lopsided in the first round for the way I built it out, it's got to be Bama Clemson. I personally think Bama would win that game comfortably, but when looking at, I mean, Iowa State, Washington State could be really good too. Wazoo's been really impressive, and Iowa State hasn't been bad, so those two could be good. Because to me, JMU Ole Miss, that would be a fun one to watch, but I think Ole Miss kind of cakewalks there. And I think Oregon's just a better team by and far than Oklahoma State. So I'll still stick with it. I'll say Bama Clemson because, Kalen DeBoer, he has experience, but it's his first time in the playoffs with Alabama, obviously coming from Washington. And then we get to see Dabo Sweeney, who's been complaining about the playoff system and complaining about NIL a lot, but he has experience. He's won a handful of national championships in his career with Clemson. So two really good teams. It would be at Bama, so it'd be really fun to see how Clemson fares on the road, obviously at Bryant-Denning Stadium. But yeah, for me, it's my 8-9 matchup. It's a true toss-up, but for me, if I had to pick one, it would be Bama to win that game. But looking at your first rounds, what about you? Which one do you like the most?
So kind of the one that I hammered down between these two, it's splitting hairs, but I'm going to go with Miami, Tennessee. Like I said, my 6-11. I think in Hard Rock, it would be about 50-50 Tennessee fans and Miami fans, even though it's a Miami home game. These offenses are terrific. I think defensively, it'll be a physical game, which is something that I can't really say for any of the other matchups. Maybe Penn State, Alabama just beats them by a hair. But I think these offenses are so explosive, and specifically the D line play is something that I would focus on. Nico I guess, are we calling him a freshman, even though he played in the bowl game? Yeah, he's a freshman. And then Cam Ward, the fifth year, sixth or fifth or sixth, I don't even know.
I think
But point is, he's played a lot of college football. And that would be awesome to me. We're kind of seeing like the old guard of great quarterbacks versus the new era of great quarterbacks. So I think that would be terrific. But like I said, a Happy Valley whiteout game versus Alabama would be insane as well. So if I had to choose between the two, I'm going Miami, Tennessee because of the explosiveness factor. But if I went like hard-nosed football, I would go Penn State, Alabama, just because of the atmosphere and what that game would look like if it was an actual, if it was actually going to happen. But I mean, just going through this, just thinking about it, just calculating it, 12-team playoff, we've been waiting for it. I
yeah.
know, you and me, we've been waiting for this. We've been doing it. We've been huge on the playoff. And I think they like as long as these games aren't all blowouts, I think they got it right. And hopefully they do. And we'll come back in about a month and kind of recalculate what we're looking at in our standings here. But I mean, it's so sweet. Just looking at these things, just it's
Yeah.
so cool.
Yeah, I was listening to yours. Your bracket's definitely more realistic compared to mine. I went with a very sicko approach to it. And I was trying to calculate a way in. Obviously, my dad was in the Army, but trying to see if the Army Navy game, with how they're both playing, if that could have any stake in the playoffs. But yeah, I think I went with more of a shocking pick. Yours is definitely more realistic, but those matchups are exciting on your side. Bama
Yeah.
Penn State for a whiteout. Oh my gosh. I couldn't wait to sit down and watch a January Happy Valley game against Bama. That would be so fun. Like you said, we have been early aged adapters of the expanded playoff system. We've been calling for it for years. I mean, hell, I wanted it like the D3 and the D2 systems where you play a 32 team bracket, but I'm so happy with 12. I love the bracketology behind it. I think it's so fun, and I'm so fired up for it this year.
Yeah, and speaking of bracketology, maybe Joe Lenardi gets in here and starts doing the predictions for it there. But yeah, I mean, if it weren't like ideally in my mind, if it were up to me, I wouldn't have changed the conferences, but obviously that was because of money. This would have been perfect if it weren't for conference realignment. But now that we have it, we gotta live with it. It's what it is at this point. Um, it's just an absolute grind. Big Ten and the SEC for until further notice, it's just an absolute grind of the months of October and November. And these teams got to prove it. It's not like with the four team where you're like arguing resumes where Georgia can play a cupcake schedule, waltz in undefeated, and make the playoff just by default. You got to earn it now. You got to earn it. I know it expanded the field, but now that these conferences are loaded, the schedules are no longer easy because they can't be. You're playing more conference games, you're playing harder conference games. So it's just terrific. It is just absolutely terrific. And I cannot wait to watch every second of every big game for the rest of this year. It's just so awesome.
Of course, it's a new age of college football. From Sideline Signal, I'm Andrew, joined as always by Tyler. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, comment. We like to read the comments and interact with our fans, but make sure to continue to listen, and we appreciate every single one of you. But yeah, college football is back. It's the new age, and we're fired up. So thank you all for listening. Have a great rest of your day.